And otherwise, and there's a sort of feeling that you're not being true to yourself if you don't have that. Whereas I think actually to be true to yourself, if you are somebody who plays gamelan twice a week, but also plays the guitar when he goes home and plays sort of light jazz on the piano and also records interviews and does work in museums, and the way to be true to yourself is to do all those things, and not to try and think in too much in categories, but actually just allow them to all cross-fertilise, and I think that's actually the honest path. But it's, again, that's a fairly recent thing that I've kind of realised, that we're all doing that now. That's what being a musician now is you do all these things. And
so for the gamelan you rehearse as a group, but you mentioned doing Western music, you rehearse at home alone?
Well, my practice at home is, yeah, I mean, most of my Western music, some of it is collaborative with dance companies, for example, sometimes even with other composers, where I will contribute something electronic to something instrumental that they're writing or something like that. That happens. But on the whole, I'm a sort of studio-based musician, so I sit in front of a computer and some loudspeakers and I make music. And then sometimes I will involve players in that I'll go and record a cellist and use what I've recorded in a piece, or I will write some notes and then at the end of the process go and work with a cellist. But most of the time is sort of spent on my own, yeah. So that's very different. And working with the gamelan, Lila Cita I actually wrote in a very kind of Western composer-ish sort of way, in that I kind of wrote a full score of it and I told everybody what to play. Whereas the work with the community group, I develop much more while I'm with the musicians and I try things out. So, I mean, I did do some of that for Lila Cita at an early stage. Yeah, I mean, the chance of working and the piece that we're doing, I've been working very much with Manny and Kate. They've contributed as much musical ideas. But then I take it away and to actually make the structure and the form and to make it fit with the Western instruments and to make it working with the dancers and the counts and what dancers want more of this and less of that, and then it's a collaborative in a different way. But the actual work then takes place in the studio. It's solitary.
So in the future, do you see? How do you see yourself? Are you going to be? Well, maybe it's not the right question. Do you think you will be composing equally Balinese or on a gamelan?
That entirely depends on the market, really. Supply and demand. I usually work to commission because I'm an essentially very lazy person. I don't tend. I've recently been doing quite a lot of stuff that hasn't been commissioned, but the stuff that hasn't been commissioned never gets finished. It's working on ideas, and then I'll get a commission and I'll draw on those ideas and bring them in. But the finished pieces are almost always commissioned. So whether I will be working equally on if I suddenly get thousands of gamelan commissions, I might exclusively work on gamelan, but it's unlikely. And I like the variety. I'm trying to think of other things about the history of gamelan in Britain that I should be telling you that maybe I know because I've been doing it for so long, rather than about Nye Parry, the composer, which is a...
But it's okay.
I'm sure it's relevant. I'm sure
experience of
it is, yeah, and how it is kind of... And I mean, I suppose one of the things that is interesting is in terms of the history is the involvement of composers, and that's of course true in America as well. And is that gamelan at York? Gamelan was where we met weird, interesting people. In the department, and it had a very strong kind of sense of being a sort of social group as well as a musical group within the department. So people tended to be friends with other gamelan players. You did have friends who didn't play gamelan, but on the whole, certainly the composers almost all played gamelan, at least for a bit. Some of them then decided they didn't like it, but they all tried it. and the musicologists and the people who are interested in more than just playing their instruments. You know, they tended to play the gamelan. And I think that's always been the case, that there's an awful lot of the people who... And people who are interested in contemporary music, you know, the people who are interested in playing 19th century chamber music and things like that tended not to play the gamelan, but the people who wanted to play Steve Reich and Stockhausen and whatever contemporary music all played gamelan as well. That was it's sort of part of being a sort of I don't know. It's part of being an inquiring musician. I mean, I'm being terribly insulting to 19th century musicologists, but they're not going to watch this film either anyway. So why not? So there's always been this thing, and so a lot of people were also composing for gamelan. There's a guy at York, Clive Wilkinson, for example, who wrote some beautiful, beautiful gamelan pieces. There was an extraordinary piece called From the Flowering Current, I think it was called, which had 5 movements. The first used only one note of the scale, at all different pitches and things, and it had a poetic text that was, I think, spoken. And then the second movement used 2 notes, and the third movement used 3 notes, and the fourth used 4 notes, etc. So it built up, and so from this very sparse thing, which was just one pitch moving through the gamelan, to this quite kind of busy piece. And he did another one called Counting Song that was it became a counting song because he did a vocal version of it, which again was, I mean, there's some lovely, lovely music. I mean, he wrote lovely orchestral music as well, and but he was a big member of the York Gamelan. And there was an extraordinary piece for E-flat, clarinet and gamelan called Niesti by a guy called Anthony something, who played the E-flat clarinet. And I remember that it was played in the Lions Concert Hall, which was our concert hall at York. And halfway through it, the doors to the outside at the back flew open. It was a stormy day, and the doors flew open, and the wind rushed through the gamelan, and this was an extraordinary sort of moment of tension. And it was a perfect point in the music, and everybody got very excited about this piece. So there was a lot of composing for gamelan going on in York, and a lot of, I noticed that Jigs lent me the other day a CD that that her husband John White had recorded before I was playing even, of the English Gamelan Orchestra at the QEH, and all those pieces or most of them were...
Before you were playing gamelan, who were they?
Well, the English Gamelan Orchestra was the first gamelan in Britain, and it was a group of composers who played the Embassy Gamelan. If you've not heard about these...
Who were they? They
were... well, Neil Sorrell was a member, Alan Parsons, I believe, Mark Lockett, I think, Janet Sherborne, I think Peter Weigold had something to do with it, because I went to a dinner party with him once in which he said,
there was a group before.
There was a group.
Neil.
Yeah, I mean, it was Neil. Neil was part of it, and Alec, of course. I think. Alec Roth and Dave Posnett, who started the Durham Gamelan. Okay, right, this early stuff, yeah. They did an Arts Council tour of Britain, that Contemporary Music Network, it was called, playing contemporary, and they commissioned a lot of pieces. They commissioned Michael Nyman, who wrote a piece called Time's Up, which was a sort of arrangement of something that he'd written for the Michael Nyman band as well, I think, or it might have been the other way around. Maybe he then arranged it for the Michael Nyman band. And it was called Time's Up because he ran out of time writing it, so it kind of dribbles away in a rather peculiar way, but it was quite a funky piece. Totally misunderstanding the gamelan. All the instruments were playing, so there was a canon part, which was incredibly fast and almost unplayable, so you probably needed 2 players to play it, and things like that. He didn't really know the instruments at all.
So you had that gamelan before you started in York?
No, I hadn't heard it. I only heard it recently.
Okay.
But what I realised was that a lot of the pieces that we played in York, because we had a very limited repertoire in York, And a lot of those pieces that we played were from the English Gamelan Orchestra. So we always played some Lou Harrison. There's this Michael Parsons piece which is based on English change ringing.
Do you know which year that group was?
And it was, as I said before, a group of composers, and they played on the embassy instruments, as far as I know. So the embassy gamelan was, I think, possibly the first one playable gamelan in the country. The first gamelan in the country was the Raffles, of course.
Okay.
And but the Raffles is totally unplayable. And I remember when I was at York, Neil went down to try out whether the Raffles gamelan was playable, and found that it wasn't. But then the English Gamelan Orchestra did this Contemporary Music Network tour, and I don't know if they then carried on after that, but Neil got the York Gamelan in 82 or something, so I think the ego must have been, that was what Pooja was asking just before, must have been 81 or 82. I think it was 82, the tour. So it was just before Neil got the instruments, probably about the same time.
I saw the CD that was dated.
Exactly, that was, it was it.
The year of my birth, I think it was 81.
81, really?
I think so.
Yeah. And they had, what I remember was there was this guy who used to do the posters for all the Contemporary Music Network tours, and they were these extremely colourful drawings, and he had a very kind of distinctive style, and you see them still somewhere, sometimes these contemporary music. And they had a wonderful poster of three guys, I think, sitting at a bonang or something, but they had kanungs on their heads. So it was just these sort of gamelan heads and mallets, and that was the poster for the tour. And that there was one up in Neil's in the gamelan room at York. So that's how we knew about it, and because we used to play all those pieces, one of the interesting ones which we hated, and actually when I listened to it on the CD, because it's a very bad recording of it, but I liked it a lot more, was this change ringing piece. And I think it was quite interesting. Michael Parsons, it's called Changes, and it's based on the patterns of British change ringing church bells.
Oh, of course, right.
Which is a very interesting thing to do, but it made it an impossible piece to play, because in change ringing you actually learn your patterns by learning where to hold back a beat and then where to move forward a beat, and you're just responsible for one note. But he took these patterns, which are permutations, and made you play them. And so you had these ridiculous, complicated things to remember. And with rests, and then changing the permutation every time round. So it was and it was too fast to read, and it was too difficult to memorize, because actually there's no musical logic to it. It was purely mathematical logic. So it was a nightmare, that piece. So that was the York Gamelan, and then Durham had a Slendro set when I started, and we used to go up and play on it, and share concerts with the Durham group, I seem to remember, on a couple of occasions, or maybe. And a guy called Dave Posnett was in charge of that. And I had a very good friend who went to Durham, and he joined that group, so we kind of would meet when we went up to play it. But he didn't become a gamelan sort of person after that. But for that brief period, he was in that group. So that was the Durham group. Oxford and Cambridge had groups, and obviously Xerxes will have talked a lot about the Cambridge group. And that was it. That was all the gamelan there was in the country.